Hi, welcome to Bernard's Essay Talk, and today's question is: how accurate is it to say that the threat posed to government by radical reformers in the years 1792 to 1819 was extremely serious? I'm going to talk about this in three parts. In the first, I'll set out the threat to the government in the 1790s, which was after the French Revolution and when Britain was at war with France. In the second, I'll talk about a second moment of threat after 1815, following the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And in the third, I'm going to argue that both of these threats were indeed serious, but overstated, which will be my thesis statement, which is to say, I will argue that the threat posed to the government between the years 1792 and 1819 was indeed serious, but it never really threatened the existing order. So starting with the first of these and part one, the threat posed to the government in the 1790s. And of course, this all begins with the French Revolution, which was a complete and total shock and an enormous threat to the ruling elites across the whole of Europe. And here's a flavour of how the English ruling class felt about it.
The malignant spirit, born of the odious French Revolution. There is a sickness, a dangerous threat of rampant insurrection.
Creeping cholera of revolution.
Damn it gets worse by the hour. I fear for my neck more than ever.
And they were right to be fearful, as the French Revolution gave power to ideas of liberty and equality and fraternity and political and constitutional rights. In addition, it also revived our own radical tradition, claiming the rights of what it liked to call free-born Englishmen. And both of these traditions, the French and the English, were powerfully brought together in Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, which pretty much set the agenda for radicalism as universal suffrage and annual parliaments. And then, hard on the heels of the revolution, came war with France. And wars are always great accelerators of change and often instruments of upheaval. And this war with France was expensive and increasingly paid for by the poor through indirect taxes on essential goods like soap or sugar. And it also had really bad economic effects. It closed European markets to British goods, it dislocated our trade, and it led to rising unemployment. All of which was made worse by disastrous harvests throughout the 1790s, driving up prices and creating shortages. And so for the historian Eric Hobsbawm, at no point since the 17th century had common people been so persistently, profoundly and desperately dissatisfied. And because of this, throughout the war, there were rumours of uprisings and moments of revolutionary threat. There was a revolutionary underground in the form of a network of what were called the United Englishmen Societies. And no, this is not a post-Brexit support group, but rather a secret revolutionary organisation modelled on the United Ireland Societies, itself an organisation committed to rebellion. In 1797, there were two naval mutinies, one at a place called Nore and at Spithead, as well as frequent riots in Jacobean Scotland and a permanent threat of rebellion by a dominated and resentful Ireland. But the real fear in this moment was of the political societies and clubs which sprang up during this time, dedicated to meeting, discussing, publishing, protesting and pushing for radical reform. And there were many of these, including the Society for Constitutional Information, the SCI, and the best known of them, the London Corresponding Society, the LCS, which corresponded with each other, but also with the revolutionaries in France, and which proved capable of mass mobilisation when in 1791 it brought out 150,000 people in an anti-war protest. And for Pitt the Younger, this was an organisation with the potential to become a military body. And so in 1790, this combination of radical societies and popular unrest led to a real fear of revolution and invasion. However, there was no revolution, and this first moment of threat passed, so that in the early years of the 19th century, the early 1800s, radicalism actually declined. But very quickly, a new revolutionary radicalism would emerge again at the end of the war with France in 1815. Which brings us to part 2 and the threat posed to the government after 1815. And this also begins with war, in this case the end of war, which dislocated the economy as it had done so at the start of the war. In this instance, the government no longer needed uniforms from the cotton mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire, or arms from the steel mills of Sheffield and Birmingham, and demobilisation meant that 300,000 men flooded the labour market while the economy was in depression and harvests were poor, and all was made worse by the Corn Laws, such that disillusionment and hatred of government was again rife. And a new and more threatening radicalism returns, which proved to be more national, more rooted in the industrial working class, and potentially more extreme. It was supported by new and more radical political societies, the Spencerians and the Hampton Clubs, both committed to revolution, and whose watchwords, liberty or death, we can see in the cartoon here, and which were particularly powerful in the industrial and radicalised cities of the north.
Might you be familiar with the north of England? On the other side of the Pennine Hills, in Manchester and the surrounding towns of Lancashire, there is a sickness, a dangerous threat of rampant insurrection.
Get all armed! Give me my liberty, or let me die. Liberty or death!
Liberty or death! Liberty or death! Liberty or death!
And all of this was expressed in a widespread flurry of dangerous riots and risings, seen in the Sparfields riots of 1816, the Pentrich Rising and March of the Blanketeers in 1817, and of course most spectacularly at Peterloo in 1819, which was also followed by the Cato Street Conspiracy of 1820, where Arthur Thistlewood was executed for planning a revolutionary Bolshevik-style coup d'etat. And all of this was taken seriously by the government, which felt the threat to be real, and was also aware of its own limitations in the use of force. There was no national police, and in a pre-railway age it was difficult to move troops around. So that, had an attempt been more determined and better organised, the state's forces might not hold the line. Indeed, some historians have argued that had Britain had a bourgeois class willing to lead a revolution, we might have followed the French example. Here's how the course book describes it. Radical activities in the years 1815 to 17 led ministers to believe in the existence of a national revolutionary conspiracy, the work of the Hampton Clubs, the Spencerians' attempt at revolution at Sparfields, the attack on the Prince Regent, and the Blanketeers all seem to be a linked series of events leading to a general insurrection. Okay. So that's the threat posed to the government in the 1790s and after 1815. Now let's move to part 3, which asks the question, was this threat overstated? And this needs to be asked, I think, because despite the right conditions, a serious potential threat never translated into an actual and extremely serious reality. And one of the main reasons for this was because this was never an equal contest, and the weaknesses of revolutionary radicalism were probably greater than its strengths, and the strengths of the state in opposition to it was probably greater than its weaknesses. And in part, This was because the tradition of English radicalism was overwhelmingly constitutional. Now, there can be different arguments as to whether this is a good or a bad thing, but the point is, because of this, it never really sought to fundamentally challenge the state. Its methods were always peaceful protest, education and petition, and those advocating revolutionary violence were always on the fringes of this movement. Here, Henry Hunt speaks for all the best-known radicals and organisations when he said,
"There will be no violence."
And even this peaceful radicalism was countered by a deep and powerful social conservatism, what you might call a John Bull conservatism, which many have argued has been a feature of our history and culture. And even at an intellectual level, the ideology of the French Revolution was powerfully countered by Edmund Burke, arguing we should look to our own glorious revolution and not the French Revolution, and to the constitutionalism of John Locke and not the revolutionary zeal of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. As well as this, during the war, patriotism also was another conservative counterforce to revolutionary ideology. And during the war, a number of loyalist societies sprang up, such as the splendidly named Association for Preserving Liberty and Property Against Republicans and Levellers. And these loyalist societies attracted far more volunteers than did their radical counterparts. And in addition to this, what revolutionary radicalism there was organisationally weak. It had no national organisation to plan and organise a concerted campaign of subversion. And there was no way of linking together the individual conspiracies which occurred in isolation and in different parts of the country. So these were important weaknesses to the revolutionary cause. But turning away now from these weaknesses to the strengths of the state, it can be argued that in contrast to the French, British institutions were relatively stable. Of course, for any self-respecting revolutionary, the state is always going to be an instrument of oppression. But from the standpoint of its survival, the fact that it curbed the arbitrary power of the monarchy, and with the beginnings of a cabinet and party political system, there was a degree of efficiency and even a slither of legitimacy that decreased the chance of revolution, certainly in contrast to France. As well as that, the administrations of Pitt the Younger and Lord Liverpool were always on the front foot and committed, constant and highly effective in using all the resources available to them to constantly suppress, intimidate and neutralise radicalism, which makes for a final reason why the potential of radicalism did not become a revolutionary reality, which is the sheer scope and scale of the government response, including the arrest and imprisonment of leaders, the transportation of activists to Australia, the suspension of habeas corpus, an extensive and very effective network of spies, the use of both the local yeomanry and national army as dramatically seen at Peterloo, and finally with the maximum use of law to silence and eradicate radical groups, including the Treasonable Practices and Seditious Meetings Acts of 1795, which basically equated radicalism with treason, the Corresponding Act of 1799 banning the corresponding societies, the Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 outlawing any organisation of workers, and the collection of measures referred to in the Gagging Acts of 1817 and Sidmouth's Six Acts of 1819, variously banning public meetings, enabling trials without juries, increasing stamp duties on pamphlets, making them very expensive, and together effectively making any radical action illegal and therefore punishable by the state. And so, to conclude, It is for all these reasons that, although the threat posed to the government by radicalism between 1792 and 1819 was serious, it is plausible to argue that the forces and obstacles to radicalism did much to limit that threat. Indeed, it is perhaps a paradox that because the British state took the threat so seriously and did so much to prevent it, that in reality it was more a threat in the minds of the ruling elites than in the reality of power.